They called me a turtle behind the wheel, mocked my cautious driving, and demanded I speed up their precious commutes. What they didn't realize was that this turtle had 23 years of experience in insurance fraud investigation, and their reckless impatience was about to cost them everything they owned. Sometimes the slowest route leads to the most devastating destination. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Chin, and at 51, I thought I'd seen every type of fraud, scam, and deception imaginable during my career as a senior insurance investigator. I specialized in vehicular fraud cases, the kind where people staged accidents for quick payouts or exaggerated injuries for larger settlements. My methodical approach and attention to detail had saved my company millions over the years, but it had also earned me a reputation for being slow and overly cautious. Little did I know that these same qualities would become my greatest weapons when three of my neighbors decided to turn my daily commute into their personal crusade. It started innocently enough that crisp Monday morning in September. I was backing out of my driveway on Maple Ridge Drive, taking my usual careful approach to ensure no children or pets were in my path, when I heard the first honk. Long, aggressive, impatient. I glanced in my rearview mirror to see a sleek black BMW sitting behind me, its driver's silhouette gesturing frantically. I recognized the car immediately. It belonged to Derek Hoffman, the hedge fund manager who lived 3 houses down in the largest home on our street. Derek had moved into the neighborhood 2 years ago with his wife Vanessa and their twin teenage sons. Everything about the Hoffmans screamed new money. The perfectly manicured lawn maintained by a crew that came twice weekly, the matching luxury vehicles in their circular driveway, the elaborate outdoor entertainment area they'd installed within months of moving in. Derek was the type of man who wore his wealth like a uniform, ensuring everyone knew exactly how successful he was. As I continued my careful backing maneuver, checking my mirrors and blind spots as I'd been trained to do, Derek's honking intensified. I could see him in my rearview mirror, his face red with frustration, one hand on the steering wheel and the other gesturing wildly. When I finally completed my turn and began driving down Maple Ridge at a safe 25 miles per hour, Derek immediately pulled alongside me, rolling down his passenger window. "Are you kidding me right now?" he shouted across the narrow space between our vehicles. "Some of us have jobs to get to, lady. This isn't a Sunday drive through the park." I kept my eyes on the road, maintaining my speed as we approached the school zone ahead. The speed limit dropped to 15 miles per hour here, and I always obeyed it religiously. Too many children cross these streets during morning hours, and I'd investigated enough accident and pedestrian incidents to know how quickly things could go wrong. Derek's BMW roared past me as soon as we cleared the school zone, his engine noise echoing off the quiet suburban houses. I watched him speed through the next intersection, barely slowing for the stop sign, and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that came from witnessing dangerous driving behavior. In my professional life, I'd seen the aftermath of such recklessness too many times to count. The second incident occurred 3 days later, this time involving Cynthia Rodriguez, who lived directly across the street from me. Cynthia was a real estate agent who'd made a fortune during the recent housing boom, specializing in luxury properties for wealthy clients. She drove a pristine white Mercedes SUV and was known throughout the neighborhood for her perfectly coordinated outfits and her ability to close deals that other agents couldn't touch. I was turning left from Maple Ridge onto Oakmont Boulevard, waiting for a safe gap in the oncoming traffic, when Cynthia pulled up behind me in her Mercedes. The intersection was notoriously difficult, with limited visibility due to a curve in the road and heavy morning traffic. I'd learned from years of accident investigations that rushing through such intersections was a recipe for disaster. After waiting approximately 30 seconds for traffic to clear, I heard Cynthia's horn. Not a polite tap to ensure I was aware of the light change, but a sustained blast that seemed to go on forever. I glanced in my rearview mirror and saw her leaning forward over her steering wheel, her face contorted with impatience. When a safe gap finally appeared and I completed my turn, Cynthia immediately pulled alongside me at the next red light. "Seriously, Margaret?" she called out through her open window. "That gap was huge. You could have fit 3 cars through there. Some of us have jobs to get to, you know? Time is money." I turned to look at her, noting the expensive jewelry glinting on her wrists and the designer handbag visible in her passenger seat. Cynthia had always been friendly enough during neighborhood gatherings, but there was something different in her tone now, something dismissive and condescending that I hadn't heard before. "I prefer to wait for a safe opportunity," I replied calmly. "That gap wasn't large enough for safe passage." Cynthia laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the space between our vehicles. "Seriously, Margaret? That gap was huge. You could have fit 3 cars through there. Some of us have clients waiting, you know? Time is money." I turned to look at her, noting the expensive jewelry glinting on her wrists and the designer handbag visible in her passenger seat. Cynthia had always been friendly enough during neighborhood gatherings, but there was something different in her tone now. Something dismissive and condescending that I hadn't heard before. "I preferred to wait for a safe opportunity," I replied calmly. "That gap wasn't large enough for safe passage." Cynthia laughed, a sharp sound that carried across the space between our vehicles. "Safe opportunity? Margaret, you drive like you're 90 years old. It's painful to watch. Maybe it's time to consider hanging up the keys." The light turned green, and Cynthia accelerated aggressively, her Mercedes surging forward with unnecessary force. I watched her weave between slower vehicles ahead, using her superior engine power to make risky passing maneuvers that made my stomach clench. This was exactly the type of behavior that led to the cases I investigated at work. The third member of what I would later think of as my personal antagonist trio was Jason Wu, a tech entrepreneur who'd sold his startup for 8 figures and decided to semi-retire at 35. Jason lived in the contemporary glass house at the end of our street, a stark, modern structure that stood out among the traditional colonials and ranch homes that dominated our neighborhood. He drove a bright red Tesla Model S and seemed to take personal pride in demonstrating its acceleration capabilities at every opportunity. My encounter with Jason happened the following week during my regular grocery shopping trip. I was driving through the parking lot of Preston Market, carefully navigating between parked cars and pedestrians with shopping carts, when Jason appeared behind me in his Tesla. The parking lot was particularly crowded that Saturday morning, with families loading groceries and elderly shoppers moving slowly between vehicles. I was proceeding at what I considered a safe speed for the conditions, approximately 5 miles per hour, when Jason began honking. I could see him in my mirrors, his hands gesturing impatiently as if my cautious driving was somehow preventing him from reaching his destination. When I stopped to allow an elderly gentleman with a walker to cross in front of me, Jason's patience finally snapped. He pulled around me in a maneuver that required driving partially onto the landscape median, his Tesla's silent engine allowing him to appear suddenly beside my window. "Are you serious right now?" he called out. "It's a parking lot, not a funeral procession. You're literally going slower than people walk." I looked over at him, taking in his expensive casual wear and the irritated expression on his young face. Jason had always struck me as someone who'd never had to wait for anything in his life, and my driving apparently represented an unacceptable delay in his carefully scheduled existence. "There are pedestrians everywhere," I pointed out, gesturing toward the busy parking lot around us. "Someone could be seriously hurt if we're not careful." Jason shook his head in apparent disgust. "You know what your problem is, Margaret? You're so paranoid about everything going wrong that you can't function in the real world. It's like watching someone afraid of their own shadow try to drive a car." He accelerated away, his Tesla silent but unmistakably fast as he maneuvered through the parking lot at what had to be 3 times my speed. I watched him claim a parking spot near the store entrance, noting how he'd managed to arrive only 30 seconds before I did, despite his aggressive driving. The time saved was negligible, but the risk he'd created for other shoppers was significant. Over the following weeks, these encounters became a regular pattern. Derek, Cynthia, and Jason seemed to coordinate their departures from the neighborhood with mine, ensuring that at least one of them would be stuck behind my careful driving each morning. Their frustration grew more vocal and more personal with each encounter. Derek began honking the moment he saw me backing out of my driveway, as if the sight of my careful reversing maneuver was enough to trigger his impatience. Cynthia started making exaggerated gestures through her windshield, pointing at her watch and shaking her head in theatrical dismay whenever she found herself behind me. Jason took to revving his Tesla's simulated engine sounds, a feature he'd apparently activated specifically to express his frustration with my driving pace. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning in early October. I was driving through downtown Preston on my way to work, navigating the narrow streets that had been designed for horse-drawn carriages rather than modern vehicles. The area was particularly challenging during morning rush hour, with parallel parked cars reducing the available lane width and frequent pedestrian crossings requiring constant vigilance. I was proceeding at the posted speed limit of 25 miles per hour when I noticed all three of my neighbor's vehicles behind me in my rearview mirror. Derek's BMW was directly behind me, with Cynthia's Mercedes behind him, and Jason's Tesla bringing up the rear. It was as if they'd formed some sort of convoys specifically designed to demonstrate their collective frustration with my driving. The honking started almost immediately. Not just from Derek this time, but from all three vehicles in a discordant symphony of impatience. When I slowed to allow a delivery truck to complete a difficult parallel parking maneuver, the honking intensified. I could see Derek gesturing wildly in his BMW, his face red with what appeared to be genuine rage. At the next red light, all three of them pulled alongside me in the adjacent lane, their windows down and their voices raised in a coordinated attack that drew stares from pedestrians on the sidewalk. "This is ridiculous," Derek shouted from his BMW. "You're holding up traffic for miles behind you. Don't you understand that some people have actual responsibilities?" Cynthia joined in from her Mercedes. "It's like being stuck behind a student driver, except worse, because at least student drivers are trying to improve. You seem determined to drive this way forever."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Jason's contribution from his Tesla was perhaps the most cutting. "I've been timing your commute, Margaret. You consistently take 40% longer than necessary to cover the same distance. That's not careful driving, that's obstruction of traffic." The light turned green and I proceeded through the intersection at my usual careful pace. Behind me, the honking resumed with renewed intensity. I could see other drivers in adjacent lanes looking over with curiosity and annoyance, some of them apparently assuming I was the source of whatever traffic problem was causing such commotion. As we reached the outskirts of downtown Preston, the three vehicles behind me began making increasingly aggressive passing maneuvers. Derek swung into the oncoming lane to pass me on a stretch of road where visibility was limited by a hill crest. Cynthia followed his lead, her Mercedes accelerating past me with unnecessary speed. Jason waited until we reached a straightaway before using his Tesla's instant acceleration to surge past all of us, his vehicle silent but unmistakably fast. I watched them disappear ahead of me, their taillights quickly fading into the distance as they continued their race toward whatever destinations required such urgency. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine what it would be like to drive that way, to prioritize speed over safety, to treat public roads like personal racetracks where other drivers were merely obstacles to overcome. But then I remembered the accident reports I'd reviewed just the previous week. A family of 4 killed when an impatient driver attempted a risky passing maneuver. A teenager paralyzed when someone ran a red light to save 30 seconds. An elderly woman struck in a crosswalk by a driver who couldn't be bothered to wait for her to cross safely. Each case represented lives destroyed by the same attitude my neighbors displayed every morning. That evening, I sat in my home office reviewing insurance files and found myself thinking about Derek, Cynthia, and Jason in a different context. In my professional capacity, I'd learned to recognize certain patterns of behavior that often preceded insurance fraud. Aggressive driving was frequently associated with financial stress, as people who were struggling economically often displayed their frustration through reckless behavior behind the wheel. I wondered about my neighbors' financial situations. Derek's hedge fund success was well known throughout the neighborhood, but I'd learned enough about financial markets to know how quickly fortunes could change in that industry. Cynthia's real estate business appeared thriving, but the luxury property market could be volatile, and agents who lived as expensively as she did were often highly leveraged. Jason's tech fortune seemed secure, but young entrepreneurs who'd never experienced financial hardship sometimes made poor decisions when faced with their first serious economic challenges. As a matter of professional curiosity, I decided to do some research. Nothing invasive or unethical, just the kind of public records investigation that was routine in my insurance work. Property records, business registrations, court filings, the type of information that was freely available to anyone who knew where to look. What I discovered over the following weekend was illuminating. Derek's hedge fund, Hoffman Capital Management, had been struggling for the past 18 months. SEC filings showed declining assets under management and several significant client withdrawals. The fund's performance had lagged major market indices for 3 consecutive years, and industry publications had begun questioning Derek's investment strategy. Cynthia's real estate empire was built on a foundation of debt that would have made a casino gambler nervous. She owned 6 properties in addition to her primary residence, all purchased with minimal down payments and maximum leverage. Her monthly carrying costs exceeded $40,000, sustainable only as long as the luxury market remained strong and her sales commissions continued flowing. Jason's situation was perhaps the most interesting. His tech startup sale had indeed been substantial, but the payout structure was heavily backloaded, with performance milestones that hadn't been met. Most of his apparent wealth was tied up in stock options that couldn't be exercised for another 3 years, and his monthly expenses suggested someone living as if those future payouts were already in the bank. The picture that emerged was of 3 people who appeared wealthy but were actually walking financial tightropes, their lifestyles dependent on continued success in volatile industries. This explained their aggressive driving behavior. They weren't just impatient with my careful pace, they were stressed about everything in their lives and using our daily commute as an outlet for their mounting anxiety. But understanding their motivation didn't make their behavior any less dangerous or their treatment of me any more acceptable. If anything, knowing that their aggression stemmed from financial pressure made me more concerned about what they might do next. Desperate people often made poor decisions, and my daily reminder of their own inadequacies was clearly pushing them toward increasingly reckless behavior. The confrontation I'd been dreading finally occurred on a Friday morning in late October. I was driving through the same downtown section where their previous attack had taken place when I noticed Derek's BMW approaching rapidly in my rearview mirror. His aggressive driving style had become even more pronounced over the past week, and today he seemed determined to make some sort of statement. Instead of maintaining a safe following distance, Derek pulled his BMW to within inches of my rear bumper, a dangerous maneuver known as tailgating that significantly increased the risk of a rear-end collision. When I slowed for a pedestrian crossing, he immediately began honking and flashing his headlights, as if my compliance with traffic laws was somehow an act of aggression against him personally. At the next intersection, Derek pulled alongside me and rolled down his passenger window, but instead of the usual shouted complaints about my driving speed, he had apparently prepared a more elaborate confrontation. "Margaret," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the narrow space between our vehicles. "I've had enough of this. Your driving isn't just slow, it's dangerous. You're causing traffic backups, forcing other drivers to make risky passing maneuvers, and creating road rage situations that wouldn't exist if you just drove like a normal person." I turned to look at him, noting the stress lines around his eyes and the tension in his jaw that suggested his frustration extended far beyond our morning commutes. "I drive according to posted speed limits and traffic laws," I replied calmly. "If that creates problems for other drivers, perhaps they should examine their own expectations about travel time." Derek's face flushed darker. "Don't give me that sanctimonious bullshit. You know exactly what you're doing. You get some kind of sick pleasure out of controlling other people's schedules. It's pathetic." The personal attack was a new escalation, and I felt my own patience beginning to fray. "My driving habits are based on 23 years of investigating traffic accidents," I said, my voice remaining level despite my growing irritation. "I've seen what happens when people prioritize speed over safety." "23 years of what?" Derek asked, his aggressive tone shifting slightly toward curiosity. "I'm a senior insurance investigator," I explained. "I specialize in vehicular fraud and accident reconstruction. I've probably reviewed more traffic accident reports than you've had hot dinners." For a moment,
Derek seemed taken aback by this information. Then his expression hardened again. Well, maybe it's time to retire because your paranoia is making the roads less safe for everyone else. The light turned green and Derek accelerated aggressively through the intersection, his BMW's engine roaring with unnecessary force. But I could see him glancing at me in his rearview mirror, and I sensed that my revelation about my professional background had given him something to think about. That afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call at work. The caller identified himself as Bradley Morrison, a partner at Morrison, Sterling and Associates, a prestigious law firm in downtown Preston. He explained that he was calling on behalf of Derek Hoffman, who wished to discuss a potential legal matter related to traffic obstruction and public endangerment. Mr. Hoffman believes that your driving behavior constitutes a form of harassment, Morrison explained in the carefully neutral tone that expensive lawyers cultivated. He's prepared to file a complaint with the Department of Motor Vehicles regarding your fitness to operate a motor vehicle, and he wanted to give you an opportunity to address his concerns before taking formal action. I listened to this threat with the detached professional interest I developed over years of dealing with fraudulent insurance claims. The legal theories Morrison was suggesting were creative but largely baseless, the kind of intimidation tactics that wealthy people sometimes employed when they couldn't get their way through normal means. Mr. Morrison, I replied, please inform your client that my driving record is spotless, my vehicle insurance rates reflect my excellent safety history, and any complaint he files will be easily refuted by traffic camera footage that I'm sure shows his own violations of speed limits and safe following distances. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Mrs. Chen, my client is simply trying to resolve this matter amicably. Perhaps we could arrange a meeting to discuss a mutually acceptable solution. The suggestion that there was some sort of problem requiring a solution struck me as particularly absurd. The only solution necessary, I told him, is for your client to leave adequate time for his commute and drive according to traffic laws. If he finds that difficult, I'd be happy to recommend some excellent defensive driving courses. Morrison's tone became noticeably cooler. Mrs. Chen, I think you may be underestimating the seriousness of this situation. My client has significant resources at his disposal, and he's prepared to use them to address what he sees as a public safety issue. I almost laughed at the irony of Derek Hoffman positioning himself as a champion of public safety while driving like a maniac every morning. Mr. Morrison, your client is welcome to waste his money on frivolous legal action. As someone who investigates fraud for a living, I'm quite familiar with the difference between legitimate claims and harassment campaigns. After hanging up, I sat in my office thinking about this new development. Derek's decision to involve lawyers suggested that his frustration with my driving had reached a level that went far beyond normal road rage. He was apparently willing to spend significant money to address what was essentially his own inability to manage his time and emotions. But threatening me with legal action had been a mistake. In my line of work, I'd dealt with countless people who tried to use intimidation to avoid responsibility for their actions. Derek's threats only served to confirm what I'd already suspected about his character and his current level of desperation. More importantly, his lawyer's call had given me valuable information about Derek's state of mind and his available resources. Someone who was truly financially secure wouldn't waste money on frivolous legal threats over traffic complaints. The fact that he was prepared to invest in this campaign suggested that his stress levels were even higher than I'd estimated. That evening, I did some additional research into Derek's recent activities. Public records showed that Hoffman Capital Management had lost another major client the previous month, reducing the fund's assets under management to less than half of its peak value. Industry websites reported that Derek had been forced to lay off most of his staff and was now essentially operating as a one-man shop from a much smaller office space. The financial pressure he was under would have been devastating for someone who'd built his identity around his success as a hedge fund manager. Every morning when he saw me driving carefully and deliberately, taking my time and showing no signs of the stress that was consuming his life, it must have felt like a personal affront to his worldview. Understanding Derek's motivation made his behavior more predictable, and in my experience, predictable behavior was easier to manage. If he wanted to escalate this conflict, I was prepared to defend myself using the same methodical approach that had made me successful in my professional career. The following Monday brought a new wrinkle to the situation. As I was backing out of my driveway with my usual care, I noticed not just Derek's BMW waiting behind me, but also a small sedan with tinted windows parked across the street. When I began my drive toward downtown, both vehicles followed, maintaining what appeared to be coordinated surveillance. At the first traffic light, I could see Derek in his BMW gesturing toward the sedan, as if he was directing the other driver's actions. The sedan's driver remained invisible behind the tinted glass, but the vehicle maintained a consistent distance behind Derek's car throughout our journey. When we reached the downtown area where my previous confrontations with Derek had occurred, the sedan suddenly accelerated and pulled alongside me. The passenger window rolled down to reveal a middle-aged man with a camera, who began taking photographs of me behind the wheel. The coordination between Derek and this unknown photographer was obvious, and I realized that he was documenting my driving behavior for his threatened legal action. The photographer continued taking pictures as I drove through several intersections, carefully following all traffic laws, while Derek and his accomplice presumably gathered evidence of my allegedly dangerous driving habits. I found the entire performance amusing rather than intimidating. In my professional work, I dealt with countless attempts at evidence manipulation and fraudulent documentation. If Derek thought that photographs of me driving legally would somehow support his harassment claims, he was even more delusional than I'd given him credit for. But the involvement of a hired photographer suggested that Derek was serious about escalating this conflict, and that he was prepared to invest significant resources in his campaign against me. This wasn't just road rage anymore. It was a coordinated effort to force me to change my behavior through legal intimidation. That afternoon, I received another call from Bradley Morrison. This time, his tone was more confident, as if he believed his client had gained some advantage over the weekend. "Mrs. Chen, we've conducted a thorough documentation of your driving patterns, and we're prepared to file formal complaints with both the Department of Motor Vehicles and the Preston Police Department. Our evidence clearly shows a pattern of traffic obstruction that creates dangerous conditions for other drivers." I listened to this updated threat with the same professional detachment I'd maintained during our previous conversation. "Mr. Morrison, I'd be very interested to see this evidence, since I'm confident that your documentation shows me driving within posted speed limits and following all applicable traffic laws." Morrison's confidence faltered slightly. "The issue isn't whether you're technically following the law, Mrs. Chen. The issue is whether your behavior creates hazardous conditions that endanger other motorists." This was a more sophisticated legal argument than Derek's original complaints, and I suspected that Morrison had done some research into traffic law since our last conversation. But his theory still relied on the assumption that driving carefully was somehow more dangerous than driving aggressively. "Mr. Morrison," I said, "I think your client may have failed to mention that he regularly exceeds posted speed limits, follows other vehicles at unsafe distances, and makes illegal passing maneuvers in areas with limited visibility. I'd be happy to provide my own documentation of his driving behavior if this matter proceeds to formal proceedings." The silence that followed suggested that Derek hadn't been entirely honest with his lawyer about the circumstances surrounding our conflict. Morrison's next words confirmed my suspicion. "Mrs. Chen, perhaps we should arrange a meeting where all parties can discuss their concerns directly. Sometimes these disputes can be resolved more efficiently through face-to-face communication." The suggestion of a meeting intrigued me. In my insurance work, I'd found that fraudulent claimants often revealed their true motivations when confronted directly with contrary evidence. If Derek was willing to sit down and explain his position, I might learn something useful about his current state of mind and his future plans. I'd be willing to meet, but only if your client is prepared to discuss his own driving behavior as well.
This isn't a one-sided situation, regardless of how he's chosen to present it to you. Morrison agreed to arrange the meeting, and we scheduled it for the following Friday afternoon at his law office. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Derek's escalation of this conflict might actually work to my advantage. By involving lawyers and threatening formal action, he was creating a paper trail that would document his harassment campaign if I ever needed to defend myself. More importantly, his willingness to invest time and money in this dispute suggested that his financial stress was even worse than I'd suspected.
Someone who was truly successful wouldn't waste resources on traffic complaints, no matter how frustrated they became with their daily commute. The meeting at Morrison's law office turned out to be even more revealing than I'd anticipated. Derek arrived looking haggard and agitated, his expensive suit unable to hide the stress that was clearly consuming him. He spent the first 10 minutes of our conference outlining his complaints about my driving, but his presentation was rambling and emotional rather than logical and fact-based. "She's doing this deliberately," Derek insisted, his voice rising as he addressed Morrison rather than speaking to me directly. "Every morning, it's the same thing. She waits until she sees me backing out of my driveway, then times her departure to ensure maximum inconvenience. It's calculated harassment disguised as careful driving." I listened to this paranoid interpretation of my routine with professional interest. In my experience, people who believed in elaborate conspiracy theories were often dealing with stress levels that affected their ability to think clearly. "Mr. Hoffman," I said when he finished his presentation, "I leave for work at the same time every morning because I have a regular schedule. I'm not timing my departure based on your activities, and I'm certainly not trying to inconvenience you personally." Derek turned toward me with an expression of pure frustration. "Don't act innocent, Margaret. You know exactly what you're doing. You get some kind of sick satisfaction out of controlling other people's schedules." The personal attack was delivered with enough venom to make Morrison visibly uncomfortable. I could see the lawyer realizing that his client's emotional state might be compromising their legal position. "Mr. Hoffman," I replied calmly, "in my professional capacity, I investigate insurance fraud, including staged accidents and deliberate traffic incidents. If I wanted to cause problems for other drivers, I'd know exactly how to do it. Driving carefully within posted speed limits is not harassment, it's responsible behavior." Derek's face flushed darker. "Your profession is irrelevant to this discussion. The issue is your deliberate obstruction of traffic flow through unnecessarily slow driving." I turned to address Morrison directly. "Actually, my profession is very relevant. As someone who investigates traffic accidents professionally, I've developed driving habits based on accident prevention rather than time optimization. I've seen too many cases where aggressive driving led to serious injuries or fatalities." Morrison nodded thoughtfully. "Mrs. Chen, could you elaborate on your professional background? I think it would help me understand your perspective on this matter." For the next 20 minutes, I explained my work with insurance fraud investigation, the types of cases I handled, and the driving behaviors I'd identified as high risk through my accident reconstruction experience. I could see Morrison taking detailed notes, and I suspected he was beginning to understand that his client's position was weaker than originally presented. Derek became increasingly agitated as I described my professional qualifications. "This is all irrelevant," he interrupted repeatedly. "The issue is that she's deliberately interfering with traffic flow." When I finished my explanation, Morrison leaned back in his chair and studied both of us carefully. "Mr. Hoffman, based on Mrs. Chen's professional background and our discussion today, I'm not confident that we have a strong case for traffic obstruction. Her driving behavior appears to be based on legitimate safety concerns rather than deliberate harassment." Derek's reaction to this assessment was explosive. "Are you kidding me? I'm paying you to solve this problem, not to take her side. If you can't handle a simple traffic dispute, maybe I need a different lawyer." Morrison's expression became noticeably cooler. "Mr. Hoffman, my obligation is to provide you with honest legal advice, not to pursue frivolous claims that could damage your reputation and expose you to counter-litigation." The mention of counter-litigation seemed to catch Derek's attention.
What do you mean, counter litigation? Morrison glanced at me before answering.
If we proceed with formal complaints against Mrs. Chen, she would have the right to file her own complaints regarding your driving behavior. Based on our discussion today, it sounds like she might have grounds for harassment claims that could be more serious than traffic obstruction. I could see Derek processing this information, his anger slowly being replaced by concern as he realized that his legal threats might backfire spectacularly. In his desperation to silence my careful driving, he'd apparently failed to consider that his own behavior might not withstand legal scrutiny. Mrs. Chen, Morrison said, turning toward me, would you be willing to accept Mr. Hoffman's apology and agree to maintain the status quo regarding your respective commuting schedules? The offer of an apology was tempting, but I'd learned enough about Derek's financial situation and mental state to know that this conflict would likely continue regardless of whatever agreement we reached in this conference room. Someone as stressed and desperate as he appeared wouldn't be satisfied with a simple resolution. I'm willing to continue driving exactly as I have been, I replied. Mr. Hoffman is free to leave earlier if he requires more time for his commute, or to take an alternate route if he finds my driving pace unacceptable. Derek's face darkened again. That's not a solution, that's you dictating terms. I shouldn't have to change my schedule because you refuse to drive like a normal person. Morrison held up a hand to prevent Derek's escalation. Mr. Hoffman, Mrs. Chen's position is entirely reasonable. She's agreeing to maintain her current driving patterns, which appear to be lawful and safety conscious. You're free to adjust your own schedule or route as needed. The meeting ended without any formal agreement, but I could see that Derek's legal strategy had collapsed. Morrison was clearly unwilling to pursue frivolous claims that could damage his own professional reputation, and Derek lacked the legal knowledge to proceed on his own. As we left Morrison's office, Derek cornered me in the hallway outside the elevators. "This isn't over, Margaret," he said in a low voice that was clearly intended to be threatening. "I have resources you can't imagine, and I'm not going to let some paranoid insurance investigator ruin my life." The threat was delivered with enough intensity to make me genuinely concerned about Derek's mental state. In my professional work, I'd learned to recognize when someone's stress levels had pushed them toward potentially dangerous behavior. "Mr. Hoffman," I replied calmly, "your life is being ruined by your own poor decisions, not by my driving habits. If you're experiencing financial difficulties, perhaps you should focus on addressing those problems instead of blaming other people for your stress." Derek's expression shifted from anger to shock, and I realized that my casual mention of his financial problems had hit closer to home than he'd expected. He opened his mouth as if to respond, then apparently thought better of it and walked quickly toward the stairwell. As I drove home from Morrison's office, I reflected on what I'd learned during our confrontation. Derek's financial stress was clearly worse than I had suspected, his emotional state was deteriorating rapidly, and his willingness to waste money on frivolous legal threats suggested that his decision-making ability was seriously compromised. Someone in Derek's position might be capable of almost anything if they became desperate enough. I made a mental note to be more careful about my personal security and to document any future interactions with him or his associates. The weekend passed quietly, but Monday morning brought a new escalation that confirmed my concerns about Derek's deteriorating mental state. As I backed out of my driveway with my usual care, I noticed not just Derek's BMW waiting behind me, but also Cynthia's Mercedes and Jason's Tesla. All three of my antagonistic neighbors were apparently coordinating their departures to ensure maximum impact during our commute. The coordinated harassment began immediately. Derek positioned his BMW inches from my rear bumper, while Cynthia and Jason flanked me in adjacent lanes, creating a formation that trapped me between their vehicles. When I slowed for a pedestrian crossing, all three began honking simultaneously, creating a cacophony that drew stares from everyone within several blocks. At the next traffic light, Derek pulled alongside me and rolled down his window, but instead of his usual complaints about my driving speed, he had apparently prepared a more elaborate confrontation. "Margaret, I know all about your financial situation. Divorced, no kids, living on a government salary. You drive like an old lady because you are an old lady, and you're taking out your frustrations on people who actually matter." The personal attack was designed to provoke an emotional response, but it also revealed that Derek had been investigating my background just as I had been investigating his. The difference was that my research had focused on publicly available financial records, while his had apparently delved into personal details about my family life.
My personal circumstances are irrelevant to traffic safety, and I'm not frustrated about anything, Mr. Hoffman.
Hoffman, I'm simply driving according to posted speed limits and traffic laws. Cynthia joined the attack from her Mercedes. Come on, Margaret, we all know you're doing this on purpose. You get some kind of power trip from controlling other people's schedules. It's pathetic. Jason's contribution from his Tesla was more analytical, but equally hostile. I've been tracking your commute times, Margaret. You consistently take 37% longer than necessary to cover the same distance. That's not careful driving. That's deliberate obstruction. The light turned green, and I proceeded through the intersection at my usual careful pace while my three neighbors continued their coordinated harassment campaign. But something had shifted in their approach. The personal attacks and coordinated timing suggested that this was no longer just about driving frustration. They had escalated to a deliberate campaign designed to force me to change my behavior through intimidation. That evening, I sat in my home office and began documenting everything I'd observed about their financial situations and their escalating behavior. My professional training had taught me to recognize patterns that might indicate fraudulent activity. And what I was seeing from Derek, Cynthia, and Jason displayed several concerning indicators. Derek's hedge fund was clearly in serious trouble, but he was maintaining an expensive lifestyle that suggested either hidden assets or dangerous levels of debt. Cynthia's real estate empire was over-leveraged to a degree that would collapse if the luxury market experienced even a minor downturn. Jason's tech fortune was largely theoretical, tied up in stock options that couldn't be exercised for years, yet he was spending as if those future payouts were guaranteed. All three were living beyond their actual means, maintaining facades of wealth that required constant cash flow to sustain. Their aggressive driving behavior and increasing hostility toward me suggested that their stress levels were approaching critical thresholds. In my experience, people in such situations often made desperate decisions that could destroy not just their own lives, but the lives of anyone around them. I decided to expand my research beyond simple financial records. Using the same investigative techniques I employed in insurance fraud cases, I began looking into their recent activities, business dealings, and personal relationships. What I discovered over the following week painted a picture of three people whose apparent success was built on foundations of sand. Derek's hedge fund had been hemorrhaging clients for over 2 years, but he'd been hiding the extent of the losses through creative accounting that bordered on fraud. He'd been using new investor capital to pay returns to existing clients, a classic Ponzi scheme structure that could only end in disaster. The mathematical reality was that Hoffman Capital Management would collapse within 6 months unless Derek could somehow attract a massive influx of new capital. Cynthia's real estate business was even more precarious. She'd been using bridge loans to purchase properties faster than she could sell them, creating a portfolio of expensive homes that required constant financing to maintain. Her monthly carrying costs exceeded her commission income by almost 3 to 1, sustainable only as long as she could continue finding lenders willing to provide short-term financing. The moment credit markets tightened or luxury sales slowed down, her entire empire would crumble. Jason's situation was perhaps the most interesting from a psychological perspective. His tech startup sale had been structured with performance milestones that were becoming increasingly unlikely to be met. The acquiring company was struggling financially, and industry insiders suggested that Jason's stock options might ultimately be worthless. But he'd been living as if he was already a multimillionaire, accumulating debts based on future payouts that might never materialize. All three were essentially gambling with their financial futures, maintaining expensive lifestyles through borrowed money and creative financing arrangements. Their morning aggression toward me was a symptom of much deeper problems that went beyond traffic frustration. But understanding their motivations also gave me insight into their vulnerabilities. People who were living beyond their means were often willing to take significant risks to maintain their facades of success. If pushed hard enough, they might make decisions that would expose them to serious legal and financial consequences. I began developing what I thought of as a strategic response to their harassment campaign.
Instead of simply enduring their attacks or trying to avoid confrontation, I would use my professional expertise to apply pressure where they were most vulnerable. Not to harm them deliberately, but to force them to confront the consequences of their own poor decisions. The opportunity to implement my strategy came sooner than expected. The following Tuesday morning, as I was driving through downtown Preston with my usual careful attention to traffic laws, I noticed Derek's BMW approaching rapidly in my rearview mirror. His driving was more aggressive than usual, and I could see him gesturing frantically as he closed the distance between our vehicles. When we reached the intersection where our previous confrontations had occurred, Derek pulled alongside me and began shouting through his open window. But this time, his complaints weren't just about my driving speed. He was making specific accusations about my personal life, my professional competence, and my mental health that went well beyond anything that could be justified by traffic frustration. "You're a pathetic old woman living in the past," he screamed, loud enough for pedestrians on the sidewalk to stop and stare. "You investigate insurance fraud because you're too incompetent to do real work. You drive like a scared little mouse because that's exactly what you are." The personal attacks were clearly designed to provoke me into an emotional response that he could use to justify his own behavior. But they also revealed how much research he'd done into my background and how far he was willing to go to win this conflict. I maintained my calm demeanor and continued driving at the posted speed limit, but I was recording every word of his tirade using the voice memo app on my phone. In my professional work, I had learned that people often revealed more than they intended when they were emotionally agitated, and Derek's rant was providing valuable evidence of his mental state and his deliberate harassment campaign. At the next red light, Cynthia's Mercedes pulled up on my other side, and she joined Derek's attack with her own set of personal insults. "Margaret, you're embarrassing yourself," she called out. "Everyone in the neighborhood talks about how pathetic you are. A middle-aged divorcee with no friends, no family, and no life outside of your boring job." Jason's Tesla completed their formation by pulling up behind me, close enough that I could see his face in my rearview mirror. He was holding up a handwritten sign that read, "Speed up or get off the road," in large letters designed to be visible to other drivers. The coordinated nature of their attack confirmed that they'd planned this confrontation in advance. But it also demonstrated poor judgment that would work against them if I ever needed to document their harassment campaign. They were creating evidence of their own misconduct, while apparently believing they were intimidating me into submission. When the light turned green, I proceeded through the intersection at my usual pace while continuing to record their verbal attacks and aggressive driving behavior. Derek and Cynthia maintained their positions alongside me, continuing their shouted insults, while Jason followed close behind with his handmade sign. Their performance was drawing attention from other drivers and pedestrians, some of whom were recording the incident with their phones. I realized that their harassment campaign was becoming a public spectacle that would reflect poorly on their own reputations, regardless of whatever satisfaction they might gain from attacking me. But I also recognized that their behavior was escalating beyond simple traffic frustration. The personal nature of their attacks and the coordinated timing of their confrontations suggested that they were investing significant time and energy in this campaign against me. People with healthy financial and emotional situations didn't have time for such elaborate harassment schemes. That afternoon, I received an unexpected phone call from Detective Sarah Brennan of the Preston Police Department. She explained that several citizens had reported incidents of aggressive driving and public disturbances involving multiple vehicles in the downtown area, and that my license plate number had been mentioned in connection with these incidents. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Brennan said, "I want to be clear that you're not being accused of any wrongdoing, but we've received reports of traffic incidents that seem to involve some kind of ongoing dispute between you and other drivers. Can you help me understand what's been happening?" I explained the situation from the beginning, starting with Derek's initial impatience with my driving and escalating through the coordinated harassment campaign that had culminated in that morning's public confrontation. Detective Brennan listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates, locations, and specific behaviors. When I finished my account, Detective Brennan was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Chen, based on what you've described, it sounds like you're being targeted for harassment by these three individuals. Have you considered filing formal complaints against them? The suggestion hadn't occurred to me, but it made sense from a legal perspective. What would that involve? I asked. We could open investigations into harassment, aggressive driving, and potentially stalking, depending on how extensive their campaign has become. The coordinated nature of their behavior and the personal attacks you've described suggest that this has moved beyond simple traffic disputes. I agreed to come to the police station the following day to file formal statements and provide any evidence I'd collected. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Derek's decision to escalate our conflict might have serious legal consequences that he hadn't anticipated. That evening, I spent several hours organizing all the information I'd gathered about Derek, Cynthia, and Jason. Financial records, driving incident reports, recorded conversations, and documentation of their harassment campaign. The picture that emerged was of three people whose lives were spiraling out of control and who were using me as a scapegoat for their own poor decisions. But I also realized that their financial desperation made them potentially dangerous. People who were facing bankruptcy or criminal charges sometimes made irrational decisions that could harm innocent bystanders. I needed to be prepared for the possibility that their harassment campaign might escalate further. The next morning, as I was preparing to leave for my appointment at the police station, I noticed unusual activity in Derek's driveway. A large moving truck was parked in front of his house, and several men were loading expensive furniture and artwork into the vehicle. Derek was supervising the operation, but his body language suggested stress rather than excitement about a voluntary relocation. I watched from my kitchen window as Derek's BMW was loaded onto a car carrier trailer, along with what appeared to be most of his valuable possessions. His wife, Vanessa, was directing the movers with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before, possibly multiple times. The Hoffmans were clearly leaving town, and the timing suggested that Derek's financial situation had reached a crisis point that required immediate action. People didn't hire expensive moving services and relocate their entire households on short notice, unless they were fleeing from something serious. I arrived at the police station with my documentation and spent 3 hours providing detailed statements to Detective Brennan and her partner, Detective Michael Torres. They were particularly interested in the financial information I'd gathered about Derek, Cynthia, and Jason, since it provided potential motives for their increasingly desperate behavior.
Mrs. Chen, Detective Torres said after reviewing my materials, you've basically conducted a professional investigation into these individuals. Your background in insurance fraud has given you insights that most harassment victims wouldn't have. Detective Brennan nodded in agreement. The financial pressure you've identified explains why their behavior has escalated so dramatically. People who are facing bankruptcy often lash out at anyone they perceive as contributing to their problems. I explained my observation of Derek's apparent departure that morning, and the detectives exchanged meaningful glances. That's consistent with what we've been seeing, Detective Brennan said. We've had several inquiries about Mr. Hoffman from federal investigators who are looking into his business practices. The revelation that Derek was under federal investigation wasn't entirely surprising, given what I'd learned about his hedge fund's financial irregularities. But it confirmed that my assessment of his desperation had been accurate, and that his harassment campaign against me had been a symptom of much larger problems. What about Cynthia Rodriguez and Jason Wu? I asked. Are they facing similar investigations? Detective Torres consulted his notes. We've received inquiries about Ms. Rodriguez from the State Banking Commission regarding some questionable loan applications, and Mr. Wu is apparently involved in a dispute with his former business partners over the terms of his buyout agreement. The pattern was clear. All three of my antagonistic neighbors were facing serious legal and financial problems that went far beyond their ability to manage their morning commutes. Their attacks on me had been desperate attempts to control something in their lives when everything else was spiraling out of their control. Mrs. Chun, Detective Brennan said, "Given the circumstances, we're going to recommend that you obtain a restraining order against all three individuals. Their behavior has moved beyond harassment into stalking and intimidation, and their current legal troubles make them potentially unpredictable." I agreed to pursue the restraining orders, but I also realized that my neighbor's financial desperation presented an opportunity to resolve this conflict permanently. People who were facing bankruptcy and criminal charges often made decisions that exposed them to additional legal liability, especially when they were stressed and thinking irrationally. Over the following week, I continued monitoring the situations of all three neighbors while working with the police and the court system to obtain protective orders. Derek had indeed fled town, but his hasty departure had left behind evidence of financial crimes that federal investigators were eager to examine. Cynthia was scrambling to avoid foreclosure on her overleveraged properties while facing questions about loan fraud. Jason was fighting with his former business partners while trying to prevent the collapse of his stock option agreements. All three were discovering that their carefully constructed facades of wealth couldn't withstand serious scrutiny from law enforcement and financial regulators. Their attempts to live beyond their means had created vulnerabilities that were now being exploited by their creditors, investigators, and former business associates. But their legal troubles also meant that their harassment campaign against me had effectively ended. People who were dealing with federal investigators and bankruptcy proceedings didn't have time or energy to waste on traffic disputes with neighbors. Their own poor decisions had finally caught up with them in ways that made my careful driving habits seem completely irrelevant. The irony wasn't lost on me that their impatience with my slow driving had been a symptom of the same reckless decision-making that had destroyed their financial lives. They'd wanted me to drive faster, take more risks, prioritize speed over safety, because that approach matched their own life philosophies. But my careful, methodical approach had protected me from the kinds of disasters that were now consuming their lives. 3 months later, I was driving through downtown Preston at my usual careful pace when I passed the real estate office where Cynthia had once worked. A for lease sign hung in the window, and the building looked empty and abandoned. Her real estate empire had collapsed when her creditors had finally demanded payment, and she'd been forced to liquidate everything she owned to avoid criminal charges for loan fraud. Jason's situation had been even more dramatic. His former business partners had successfully argued that his stock options were forfeit due to misrepresentation during the original sale negotiations. He'd gone from paper millionaire to actual bankruptcy in less than 6 months, and was now working at a local electronics store living in a studio apartment across town. Derek's fate was still unfolding in federal court, where prosecutors were building cases for investment fraud, tax evasion, and securities violations. His hedge fund had been shut down, his assets had been frozen, and his family had relocated to another state where they were living with Vanessa's parents while awaiting the resolution of his criminal charges. All three had learned the hard way that financial success based on deception and over-leveraging was ultimately unsustainable. Their attempts to maintain expensive lifestyles through borrowed money and creative financing had collapsed when subjected to serious scrutiny from law enforcement and financial regulators, leaving them worse off than if they'd lived within their means from the beginning. I continued driving my regular route to work each morning, maintaining the same careful pace that had originally triggered their frustration. But now my commute was peaceful and uneventful, shared with other drivers who understood that arriving safely was more important than arriving quickly. The lesson wasn't lost on me that my neighbor's downfall had been caused by their own poor decisions rather than any actions on my part. I'd simply continued driving according to traffic laws and safety principles, while they had destroyed their own lives through reckless financial behavior and aggressive responses to minor inconveniences.
Their impatience with my driving had been a metaphor for their impatience with financial reality. They'd wanted quick results, immediate gratification, and shortcuts to success that didn't require careful planning or patient execution. When they encountered someone who prioritized safety over speed, their frustration had revealed the fundamental flaws in their approach to life. But I'd also learned something about the power of methodical investigation and patient observation. My professional training in fraud detection had given me insights into their vulnerabilities that they hadn't recognized themselves. By applying the same analytical techniques I used in insurance cases, I'd been able to understand their motivations and predict their behavior in ways that ultimately protected me from their harassment campaign. The experience had taught me that defensive driving and defensive living operated on similar principles: careful observation, patient analysis, and methodical responses to threats were more effective than aggressive confrontation or emotional reactions. My neighbors had destroyed themselves through their own reckless behavior, while I'd remained safe by maintaining my commitment to careful, lawful conduct. 6 months after the harassment campaign had ended, I received an unexpected letter from Derek Hoffman. He was writing from federal prison, where he was serving a 3-year sentence for investment fraud and tax evasion. His letter was an apology for his behavior during our commuting conflicts, but it was also an attempt to explain his motivations and seek some form of forgiveness for his actions. Derek wrote that his financial pressures had made him desperate and irrational, causing him to lash out at anyone who seemed to represent the careful, methodical approach to life that he'd abandoned in pursuit of quick wealth. My driving had reminded him daily of his own poor decisions, creating a psychological trigger that had escalated into harassment and intimidation. He acknowledged that his problems had been entirely self-created through reckless investment strategies and dishonest business practices. His anger toward me had been misdirected frustration with his own failures, projected onto someone who represented everything he'd chosen not to be. He asked for my forgiveness, not because he deserved it, but because he was trying to take responsibility for the harm he'd caused to others during his downward spiral. I read Derek's letter several times, considering whether to respond. His apology seemed genuine, and his acknowledgement of responsibility suggested that prison had given him time to reflect on his behavior. But I also recognized that his letter might be motivated by hopes for leniency during his appeals process rather than genuine remorse. Ultimately, I decided not to respond to Derek's letter. Forgiveness was a personal choice that didn't require communication with the person being forgiven. I could move beyond the harassment and intimidation without validating his attempts to absolve himself of responsibility for his actions. Instead, I filed the letter with the rest of my documentation from the incident, a final piece of evidence in a case that had taught me valuable lessons about human nature, financial desperation, and the power of patient, methodical responses to aggressive behavior. My morning commute remained peaceful and uneventful. I continued driving at safe speeds, following traffic laws, and prioritizing safety over convenience. Other drivers occasionally showed impatience with my careful pace, but none had ever escalated to the level of harassment I'd experienced with Derek, Cynthia, and Jason. The experience had reinforced my belief that careful, methodical approaches to life's challenges were ultimately more successful than aggressive, risk-taking strategies. My neighbors had paid enormous prices for their impatience and recklessness, while my commitment to safe, lawful behavior had protected me from harm and ultimately contributed to their downfall. Sometimes the turtle really does win the race, especially when the hares destroy themselves through their own desperate attempts to run faster than their abilities or circumstances allow. My slow, steady approach to driving had been a daily reminder to 3 people that they were living unsustainable lives, and their attempts to silence that reminder had ultimately exposed them to the consequences they'd been trying so desperately to avoid. The neighborhood was quieter now, populated by families who understood that true success came from living within their means and making careful, thoughtful decisions about their futures. My careful driving was no longer a source of conflict, but simply one small example of the methodical approach to life that led to genuine security and peace of mind. As I drove to work each morning, I sometimes reflected on the strange series of events that had transformed a simple traffic dispute into a complex case study of financial fraud and personal destruction. My professional training and investigation had protected me from becoming a victim, while my commitment to lawful behavior helped expose the illegal activities of people who'd thought they were above consequences. The lesson was clear. Patient, methodical approaches to life's challenges were ultimately more powerful than aggressive, risk-taking strategies. My slow driving had driven 3 people to financial ruin, not through any malicious intent on my part, but because it had forced them to confront the fundamental flaws in their approaches to life. They'd wanted me to drive faster, to take more risks, to prioritize speed over safety, because such behavior would have validated their own reckless approaches to life. When I refused to change my careful habits, they'd revealed their own desperation and vulnerability in ways that ultimately destroyed them. Sometimes the most effective response to aggression is simply to maintain your own principles and let your opponents destroy themselves through their own poor decisions. My turtle-like driving had been more devastating to my neighbors than any aggressive retaliation could have been, because it had forced them to recognize the fundamental flaws in their approaches to life. 1 year after Derek's imprisonment, I found myself in a position I'd never anticipated. My methodical documentation of their financial irregularities had attracted the attention of federal investigators working on a broader case involving investment fraud in our region. Special Agent Patricia Valdez from the Securities and Exchange Commission contacted me, requesting assistance with their ongoing investigation into fraudulent investment schemes targeting wealthy suburban communities. Agent Valdez explained that my research into Derek's hedge fund operations had uncovered connections to a larger network of financial criminals who'd been operating throughout the Preston area for several years. My background in insurance fraud investigation, combined with my detailed documentation of Derek's activities, made me an ideal consultant for their expanding case. The meeting took place at the Federal Building downtown in a conference room lined with whiteboards covered in financial charts and photographs of suspects. Agent Valdez was accompanied by her partner, Agent Robert Kim, and a financial analyst named Dr. Sarah Washington, who specialized in complex fraud schemes. Miss Chen, Agent Valdez began, your investigation into Derek Hoffman's activities helped us identify patterns that we'd been missing in our broader investigation. Hoffman wasn't working alone. He was part of a sophisticated network that's been defrauding investors across 3 states.
Washington spread several documents across the conference table, including financial statements, investment prospectuses, and bank records that looked remarkably similar to the materials I'd uncovered about Derek's operations. These schemes all follow the same basic pattern, she explained. Legitimate-looking investment funds that use new investor capital to pay returns to existing clients, while the principals live lavishly on the remaining money. Agent Kim pointed to a photograph on the whiteboard showing a man I didn't recognize standing next to a familiar figure. This is Marcus Delacroix, the mastermind behind the network, and that's your neighbor Derek Hoffman standing beside him at a conference in Miami last year. The photograph had been taken at what appeared to be a luxury resort with both men dressed in expensive casual wear and holding drinks beside a swimming pool. Derek looked relaxed and confident, completely unlike the stressed, desperate man I'd observed during our neighborhood conflicts. Delacroix recruited investment managers like Hoffman to operate local funds that funneled money up to his central operation, Agent Valdez explained. Each local manager was responsible for attracting wealthy clients in their area while maintaining the illusion of legitimate investment activities. I studied the documents spread across the table, recognizing the same creative accounting techniques and misleading performance reports that I'd identified in Derek's hedge fund materials. How much money are we talking about? I asked. Dr. Washington consulted her notes. Conservative estimates suggest the network defrauded investors of approximately $200 million over a 4-year period. Hoffman's operation alone accounted for about $15 million in investor losses. The scale of the fraud was staggering, far beyond what I'd imagined when I'd first noticed Derek's financial irregularities. My careful observation of his morning stress levels had led to the discovery of a criminal enterprise that had destroyed the financial security of hundreds of families across multiple states. Mrs. Chen, Agent Kim said, we'd like to ask for your assistance in expanding our investigation. Your analytical skills and attention to detail have proven invaluable, and we believe there may be other criminal operations in your area that we haven't identified yet. The request intrigued me. My insurance fraud work had always been reactive, investigating claims after suspicious activities had been reported. The opportunity to proactively identify criminal operations before they could harm additional victims appealed to my sense of justice and professional curiosity. What would that involve? I asked. Agent Valdez pulled out a tablet and showed me a map of the Preston area with various locations marked in different colors. We want you to help us identify other high net worth individuals in your community who might be operating unsustainable lifestyles that could indicate fraudulent income sources. The map showed dozens of expensive properties throughout Preston's most exclusive neighborhoods, each representing a household with significant apparent wealth that might warrant investigation. Some were marked in green, indicating individuals whose financial success appeared legitimate. Others were marked in yellow, suggesting questions about income sources or spending patterns. A few were marked in red, indicating suspected criminal activity. You've already proven your ability to identify financial irregularities through careful observation, Dr. Washington said. We're hoping you can help us develop profiles of other potential targets before they cause additional harm to investors. I agreed to assist with their investigation, understanding that my unique combination of professional training and neighborhood access made me particularly valuable to their efforts. Over the following weeks, I began applying the same analytical techniques I used to understand Derek's situation to other wealthy residents in the Preston area. The process was fascinating and disturbing in equal measure. Many of the individuals I investigated were living far beyond any legitimate income sources, maintaining expensive lifestyles through complex financial arrangements that appeared designed to obscure the true sources of their wealth. Dr. Amanda Foster, a lifestyle coach who lived in a mansion near the country club, claimed to earn her income through online courses and personal consulting, but her monthly expenses exceeded what even the most successful coaches could reasonably generate, and her business structure included offshore entities that seemed designed to hide rather than facilitate legitimate operations. Richard Sterling, who owned a chain of luxury car dealerships, was living in a $50 million estate while his businesses appeared to be losing money consistently. His personal spending patterns suggested access to significant capital that wasn't reflected in his company's financial statements, and his recent real estate purchases had been made through shell corporations with unclear funding sources. Melissa Park, a technology consultant who specialized in cryptocurrency investments, was driving cars and wearing jewelry that would require investment returns far exceeding what even successful crypto trading could generate. Her social media presence suggested constant international travel and luxury experiences that would cost more than most people earned in entire years. Each case followed similar patterns of apparent wealth that couldn't be explained by visible income sources, complex business structures that obscured financial flows, and lifestyle choices that prioritized visible luxury over long-term financial security. They were all living like Derek had lived, maintaining facades of success through unsustainable financial arrangements. My reports to the federal investigators led to expanded surveillance operations and eventually to search warrants that uncovered additional criminal enterprises. Dr. Foster was operating a pyramid scheme that had defrauded thousands of aspiring entrepreneurs who'd purchased her expensive coaching programs. Richard Sterling was using his dealerships to launder money for organized crime figures who needed to convert illegal proceeds into legitimate assets. Melissa Park was running cryptocurrency scams that targeted elderly investors who didn't understand the technology they were investing in.
The pattern was clear. Preston's wealthy communities had been systematically infiltrated by criminals who used the appearance of legitimate success to attract victims and avoid scrutiny. Their expensive homes, luxury cars, and exclusive social circles provided perfect cover for fraudulent operations that required constant access to new sources of capital. But the investigation also revealed how my conflict with Derek had inadvertently contributed to exposing this broader criminal network. His stress-induced harassment campaign against me had been a symptom of the pressure he was under to maintain his fraudulent operations while meeting Marcus Delacroix's demands for consistent profits. When Derek had escalated our dispute by hiring photographers and lawyers, he'd drawn attention to himself at exactly the wrong time. His public confrontations with me had occurred just as federal investigators were beginning to notice irregularities in his financial reporting, turning what might have been a routine audit into a comprehensive criminal investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek's impatience with my careful driving had ultimately led to his exposure and imprisonment. If he'd simply left earlier for work or taken a different route, he might have avoided the daily stress that had driven him to increasingly desperate behavior. His inability to tolerate minor inconveniences had created the very attention he'd been trying to avoid. 6 months into my consulting work with the federal investigators, I received another unexpected development. Cynthia Rodriguez, my former neighbor who'd lost her real estate empire, contacted me through a mutual acquaintance requesting a private meeting. She claimed to have information about additional criminal activities in our former neighborhood that might be relevant to the ongoing investigations. We met at a coffee shop in downtown Preston, a neutral location where Cynthia felt comfortable discussing sensitive topics. She looked dramatically different from the perfectly groomed real estate agent I'd known during our neighborhood conflicts. Her designer clothes had been replaced by modest, casual wear, and her confident demeanor had been replaced by nervous uncertainty. "Margaret," she began, "I know I treated you terribly during our disputes about your driving. I was under enormous stress, and I took it out on you instead of dealing with my real problems. I want to apologize for that behavior." I accepted her apology, understanding that Cynthia's financial desperation had made her vulnerable to the same kind of irrational behavior that had destroyed Derek's life. "What information did you want to share?" I asked. Cynthia's expression became even more serious. "Because I think some of these people are still operating in Preston, and they're probably involved in the same kinds of schemes that destroyed Derek and Jason. I don't want other families to go through what we went through." Her willingness to provide information to investigators suggested genuine remorse for her past behavior. But I also suspected that she was hoping cooperation might help her avoid additional legal consequences for her own financial irregularities. People who'd been involved in questionable transactions often became cooperative witnesses when faced with the possibility of criminal charges. I arranged for Cynthia to meet with Agent Valdez and her team, and her information proved valuable in identifying additional money laundering operations that had been using Preston's luxury real estate market to clean criminal proceeds. Several of the individuals she'd identified were already under investigation for other crimes, and her documentation helped establish patterns of criminal activity that strengthened the prosecutor's cases. The meeting also revealed how extensively criminal operations had penetrated Preston's wealthy communities. What had appeared to be a neighborhood full of successful professionals and entrepreneurs was actually a carefully constructed facade that provided cover for multiple criminal enterprises operating simultaneously. Derek's hedge fund fraud, Dr. Foster's pyramid schemes, Richard Sterling's money laundering operations, and Melissa Park's cryptocurrency scams were all connected through overlapping social and business networks that allowed criminals to share resources, identify victims, and avoid detection by spreading their activities across multiple apparent legitimate businesses. The investigation expanded beyond financial crimes to include tax evasion, identity theft, and organized crime connections that reached into major metropolitan areas throughout the region. What had started as my observation of Derek's morning stress levels had evolved into one of the largest white-collar crime investigations in the state's history. But the personal cost of these discoveries was significant. Learning that my neighborhood had been systematically infiltrated by criminals made me question my ability to assess the character and motivations of people around me. I'd lived near these individuals for years without recognizing the signs of their criminal activities until financial pressure had forced them to reveal their true natures. The experience reinforced my belief in the importance of careful observation and methodical analysis. But it also highlighted how sophisticated modern criminals had become at maintaining facades of legitimate success.
The same attention to detail that made me an effective insurance investigator was apparently necessary for basic personal security in communities where appearance and reality often diverged dramatically. My consulting work with the federal investigators continued for another year, during which time the criminal network was systematically dismantled through coordinated arrests and asset seizures. Marcus Delacroix, the network's leader, was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison after being convicted on multiple counts of investment fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Derek received additional charges related to his participation in the broader criminal enterprise, extending his prison sentence to 8 years.
Foster Richard Sterling and Melissa Park all received substantial prison sentences and were ordered to pay millions in restitution to their victims. The financial recoveries were significant, but couldn't fully compensate the hundreds of families who'd lost their retirement savings, children's college funds, and life savings to these criminal operations. Many victims faced years of financial hardship while attempting to rebuild their lives after discovering that their trusted investment advisors and business partners had been systematically stealing from them. The psychological impact on the community was equally devastating. Preston's reputation as a safe, affluent suburban community was permanently damaged by revelations that it had been a center of organized criminal activity for years. Property values declined, social trust eroded, and many residents relocated to other areas where they felt more secure about their neighbors' legitimacy. But the investigation also demonstrated the power of careful observation and methodical analysis in exposing sophisticated criminal operations. My initial documentation of Derek's financial irregularities had provided the foundation for uncovering a criminal network that might otherwise have continued operating for years, causing additional harm to countless victims. The success of the investigation led to offers for me to transition from insurance fraud investigation to federal law enforcement, but I decided to remain in my current position while continuing to consult on special cases that required my particular combination of analytical skills and attention to detail. My morning commute through Preston remained peaceful and uneventful, but the neighborhoods I drove through looked different now that I understood the criminal activities that had been hidden behind their facades of suburban prosperity. The expensive homes and luxury cars that had once represented success and achievement now reminded me of the importance of distinguishing between apparent wealth and legitimate accomplishment. The experience had taught me that my careful, methodical approach to life was more valuable than I'd ever imagined. The same qualities that made me a cautious driver had made me an effective criminal investigator, capable of recognizing patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. Derek's impatience with my turtle-like driving had been a symptom of the reckless mindset that had ultimately destroyed his life and exposed his criminal activities. His inability to tolerate careful, methodical approaches to simple tasks had revealed fundamental character flaws that extended to every aspect of his personal and professional behavior. The irony was perfect. Derek had wanted me to drive faster, to take more risks, to prioritize speed over safety, because such behavior would have validated his own approach to life. Instead, my commitment to careful, lawful conduct had ultimately led to his imprisonment and the dismantling of the criminal network he'd served. Sometimes, most effective way to defeat criminals is simply to maintain your own integrity and let their impatience with lawful behavior expose their illegal activities. My slow driving had driven Derek to financial ruin, not through any malicious intent, but because it had forced him to reveal his true character when he was under pressure. The investigation continued to generate new leads and discoveries months after the primary arrest had been completed. Criminal networks operated like spiderwebs, with connections spreading far beyond their apparent boundaries. Each arrested individual provided information that led to additional suspects, creating an expanding circle of investigations that eventually reached into multiple states and foreign countries. My role in these expanded investigations evolved from neighborhood observer to specialized consultant, helping federal agencies identify and analyze complex criminal operations that required understanding of both financial fraud techniques and human behavioral patterns. The combination of skills I'd developed through insurance fraud investigation and criminal observation proved uniquely valuable for this type of work.
But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of the entire experience was the knowledge that my commitment to safe, careful driving had played a crucial role in protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminals who'd been operating with impunity for years. Derek's harassment campaign against me had ultimately led to justice for hundreds of victims who might never have recovered their losses without the investigation that my observations had initiated. The turtle had indeed won the race, not through speed or aggression, but through patience, careful observation, and methodical analysis that revealed truths that others had missed. My slow approach to driving and life had proven more effective than Derek's reckless pursuit of quick wealth and immediate gratification. In the end, Derek's financial ruin had been entirely self-inflicted, caused by his own poor decisions and criminal behavior rather than any actions on my part. I'd simply continued living according to my principles while documenting the evidence of his illegal activities that his own impatience and desperation had revealed. The neighborhood was quieter now, populated by families who understood that true success came from honest work and careful financial management rather than sophisticated fraud schemes and criminal enterprises. My morning commute had returned to its original peaceful character, shared with drivers who appreciated safe, lawful behavior, rather than viewing it as an obstacle to their criminal activities. 2 years after the criminal network's dismantling, I received a call that would bring the entire saga full circle. Jason Wu, my former neighbor who'd lost his tech fortune, was requesting a meeting through his attorney. He'd been working at the electronics store for 18 months, living modestly while attempting to rebuild his life, and apparently had something important to discuss with me. We met at a small diner on the outskirts of Preston, far from the upscale neighborhoods where we'd once been neighbors. Jason looked completely different from the arrogant young entrepreneur I remembered. His expensive casual wear had been replaced by simple clothing, his confident demeanor replaced by humble uncertainty, and his flashy Tesla traded for a modest used sedan. "Margaret," he began, his voice lacking any trace of his former condescension, "I owe you an enormous apology for how I treated you during our neighborhood disputes. My behavior was inexcusable, and I've spent the past 2 years thinking about how differently things might have gone if I'd made better choices." Jason explained that his experience losing everything had forced him to confront fundamental flaws in his character and approach to life. The arrogance and impatience that had driven me to harass me about my driving had been symptoms of deeper problems that had ultimately destroyed his financial security and personal relationships. "I want you to know that I've been following the news about the criminal investigations. When I realized that Derek was involved in serious fraud, I started questioning everything I thought I knew about success and wealth in our community. I think I might have information that could be helpful to ongoing investigations." Jason's willingness to cooperate with law enforcement was motivated partly by genuine remorse and partly by his hope that assistance might help him avoid additional legal consequences for his own questionable business practices. During his brief period of apparent wealth, he'd engaged in tax avoidance strategies and investment schemes that bordered on fraud. "What kind of information?" I asked, maintaining the professional neutrality I'd learned during my consulting work with federal investigators. Jason pulled out a tablet and showed me financial records he'd preserved from his time as a cryptocurrency consultant. When I was advising wealthy clients on crypto investments, several of them were using digital currencies to move money in ways that seemed designed to avoid regulatory oversight. I didn't ask questions at the time because the fees were too lucrative to pass up.
The record showed patterns of cryptocurrency transactions that were consistent with money laundering operations I'd encountered during the broader investigation. Criminal organizations had been using digital currencies to convert illegal proceeds into assets that were difficult for law enforcement to trace, and Jason's clients had apparently been participating in these schemes. These clients were paying me to help them structure transactions that would minimize their tax obligations and maximize their privacy, Jason explained. Looking back, I think some of them were actually trying to hide criminal income rather than just avoid taxes. I arranged for Jason to meet with the federal investigators, and his information proved valuable in identifying additional criminal operations that had been using cryptocurrency markets to launder proceeds from various illegal activities. Several of his former clients were already under investigation for other crimes, and his documentation helped establish patterns that strengthened the prosecutor's cases. But Jason's cooperation also revealed how extensively he'd been manipulated by the same criminal networks that had used Derek and other apparently legitimate professionals.
His expertise in cryptocurrency technology had made him valuable to criminals who needed technical assistance in moving illegal money through digital markets. "Margaret," Jason said during our second meeting, "I need you to understand that my anger toward your driving wasn't really about traffic delays. I was under enormous pressure to maintain an image of success that I couldn't actually afford, and seeing you drive so carefully and deliberately reminded me daily that I was living recklessly in every aspect of my life." The psychological insight was perceptive and suggested that Jason's experience had genuinely taught him important lessons about the relationship between character and success. His former impatience with my methodical approach had been a projection of his own insecurity about his unsustainable lifestyle. "Your driving represented everything I wasn't," he continued. "Careful, patient, focused on safety rather than speed. I knew my financial situation was precarious, but I was too proud and too scared to admit it. Taking out my frustration on you was easier than confronting my real problems." Jason's analysis of his own behavior was remarkably mature compared to the entitled young man I'd known during our neighborhood conflicts. Financial disaster had apparently forced him to develop self-awareness and emotional intelligence that his previous success had allowed him to avoid. 6 months later, I received news that Derek had been released from federal prison after serving 4 years of his sentence. His cooperation with ongoing investigations had earned him early release, but his freedom came with strict conditions, including supervised probation and permanent banishment from the financial services industry. Derek's release coincided with the conclusion of the broader criminal investigation that my observations had initiated. Marcus Delacroix and his primary associates had been sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their criminal assets had been seized and distributed to victims, and the network's operations had been permanently dismantled. The final accounting showed that the investigation had recovered approximately 60% of the money stolen from victims, a remarkable success rate for white-collar crime cases. More importantly, the prosecutions had sent clear messages to other criminal organizations that sophisticated fraud schemes would be aggressively investigated and severely punished. My role in the investigation was recognized with a commendation from the Securities and Exchange Commission and an offer to join their enforcement division as a senior investigator. The opportunity was tempting, but I decided to remain in my current position while continuing to consult on special cases that required my particular expertise. The experience had taught me valuable lessons about the power of patient observation and methodical analysis in exposing sophisticated criminal operations. The same qualities that made me a careful driver had made me an effective criminal investigator, capable of recognizing patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. But perhaps the most important lesson was about the relationship between character and sustainable success. Derek, Cynthia, and Jason had all achieved apparent wealth through strategies that prioritized short-term gains over long-term stability, and their approaches had ultimately destroyed everything they'd worked to build. My commitment to careful, methodical behavior had protected me from their criminal activities while providing the foundation for exposing their illegal operations. The turtle's approach to life had proven more effective than the hare's desperate pursuit of quick wealth and immediate gratification. The turtle had ultimately won the race in ways that went far beyond my original conflicts with Derek, Cynthia, and Jason. My methodical approach to life had proven more powerful than their aggressive pursuit of quick wealth, not through any deliberate strategy on my part, but through the simple power of maintaining integrity under pressure. My morning commute through Preston remained peaceful and uneventful, but the communities I drove through had been fundamentally changed by the investigations that my observations had initiated. The criminal networks that had once operated with impunity had been dismantled, their assets seized, and their leaders imprisoned. The neighborhoods that had appeared prosperous but been built on criminal foundations had been cleansed and rebuilt around legitimate businesses and honest residents. 3 years after Derek's release, I received a final piece of correspondence that brought the entire saga to a satisfying conclusion. It was a letter from Marcus Delacroix, written from the federal penitentiary where he was serving his 25-year sentence. Like Derek's earlier letter, it was an apology,
But it was also an acknowledgement of the role that my careful observations had played in exposing his criminal organization. Delacroix wrote that his network had operated successfully for years by exploiting people's assumptions about wealth and success in suburban communities. His criminal associates had been carefully selected for their ability to maintain facades of legitimate prosperity while actually operating sophisticated fraud schemes. The system had been designed to be virtually undetectable by conventional law enforcement methods. What we didn't anticipate, Delacroix wrote, was someone with your combination of professional investigative skills and daily access to our associates' personal behavior. Your ability to recognize that Derek Hoffman's morning stress was a symptom of deeper financial problems led to discoveries that unraveled everything we'd built over 4 years of careful planning. The letter confirmed what I'd suspected throughout the investigation. My initial observations of Derek's aggressive driving and escalating harassment had provided the crucial entry point that had allowed federal investigators to penetrate a criminal network that might otherwise have continued operating indefinitely. Delacroix's acknowledgement of my role was gratifying, but the real satisfaction came from knowing that hundreds of families had recovered at least partial compensation for their losses, and that future victims had been protected from similar schemes. The patient, methodical approach to life that Derek had once mocked as turtle-like behavior had ultimately proven more effective than any aggressive enforcement strategy in bringing his criminal organization to justice. I kept Delacroix's letter with my other documentation from the case, a final piece of evidence in an investigation that had demonstrated the power of careful observation and methodical analysis in exposing sophisticated criminal operations. The turtle's victory had been complete, achieved not through speed or aggression, but through the simple persistence of maintaining integrity and paying attention to details that others missed. My work with federal investigators continued on a consulting basis, helping to identify and analyze criminal operations that required understanding of both financial fraud techniques and human behavioral patterns. The skills I'd developed through decades of insurance fraud investigation, combined with the insights gained from the Preston Criminal Network case, made me valuable for complex investigations that required both technical expertise and intuitive understanding of criminal behavior. But perhaps the most important legacy of the entire experience was the knowledge that ordinary citizens could play crucial roles in exposing sophisticated criminal operations simply by maintaining their own integrity and paying attention to inconsistencies in the behavior of people around them. My commitment to safe, careful driving had protected me from criminal manipulation while providing the foundation for bringing justice to hundreds of victims. The neighborhood remained quiet and peaceful, populated by families who understood that true success came from honest work and careful financial management rather than sophisticated fraud schemes and criminal enterprises. My morning commute had returned to its original character, shared with drivers who appreciated safe, lawful behavior and understood that arriving safely was more important than arriving quickly. Sometimes, the most effective way to defeat sophisticated criminals is simply to maintain your own principles and let their impatience with lawful behavior expose their illegal activities. My slow driving had driven Derek and his associates to financial ruin, not through any malicious intent, but because it had forced them to reveal their true character when they were under pressure. The turtle had won the race completely and permanently, protecting innocent people from sophisticated criminals who had been operating with impunity until their own reckless behavior provided the evidence necessary for their conviction and imprisonment. 5 years had passed since Marcus Delacroix's final letter, and my life had settled into a comfortable routine that bore little resemblance to the dramatic events that had transformed my quiet neighborhood into the center of a federal criminal investigation. I had accepted the position with the Securities and Exchange Commission as a senior investigator, specializing in cases that required both financial expertise and behavioral analysis. The work was challenging and rewarding, allowing me to apply the skills I developed during the Preston investigation to protect investors across the region from sophisticated fraud schemes. My new office was located in the federal building downtown, just a few blocks from where I'd first met with Agent Valdez and her team. The irony wasn't lost on me that my morning commute now took me through the same streets where Derek, Cynthia, and Jason had once harassed me for driving too slowly. The difference was that I now understood how those seemingly minor conflicts had been symptoms of much larger problems that had ultimately led to justice for hundreds of crime victims. The Preston case had become something of a legend within federal law enforcement circles, studied as an example of how observant citizens could provide crucial assistance in exposing sophisticated criminal operations. My role in the investigation was frequently cited in training materials and conference presentations, though I always emphasized that my success had been based on professional skills rather than any special intuition or remarkable insight. The techniques I'd used to analyze Derek's financial situation were standard investigative practices that any experienced fraud investigator would recognize. The difference was that I'd been in the unique position of observing his daily behavior while having access to public records that revealed the true state of his business operations. The combination of proximity and expertise had created an opportunity that might not have existed under different circumstances. But the Preston investigation had also taught me important lessons about the psychology of financial crime that continued to inform my federal work. The criminals I'd helped expose hadn't been obvious villains or hardened career criminals. They'd been apparently successful professionals who had gradually compromised their ethics through a series of small decisions that had ultimately led them into serious criminal activity. Derek's progression from legitimate hedge fund manager to investment fraudster had been gradual and incremental. His initial violations had been minor regulatory infractions that he justified as necessary competitive advantages. When those small compromises had proven profitable, he'd been willing to take slightly larger risks that had eventually led him into outright fraud and criminal conspiracy. The pattern was common among white-collar criminals, who often began their illegal activities as responses to temporary financial pressures or competitive disadvantages. What started as minor ethical violations gradually escalated into serious crimes as the perpetrators became dependent on illegal income to maintain their lifestyles and business operations. Understanding this psychological progression had made me more effective at identifying potential criminal activity before it reached the levels of sophistication that made prosecution difficult. Early intervention was often more effective than waiting for criminal schemes to mature into the kind of complex operations that required years of investigation to unravel. My current caseload included several investigations that bore similarities to the Preston network, though none had reached the same scale of coordination and criminal sophistication. Financial criminals were apparently learning from the mistakes that had led to Delacroix's arrest, developing more decentralized operations that were harder for law enforcement to penetrate and dismantle. The evolution of criminal techniques required corresponding evolution in investigative methods. Traditional approaches that relied on following financial transactions and analyzing business records were becoming less effective as criminals became more sophisticated about hiding their activities. The kind of behavioral analysis that had been crucial in the Preston case was becoming increasingly important for federal investigators who needed to identify criminal operations before they could adapt to avoid detection.
My work with the SEC had also given me perspective on the broader economic impact of the crimes I'd helped expose. The Preston criminal network had operated during a period of economic growth and optimism that had made their fraud schemes easier to sustain. Victims had been willing to invest in questionable opportunities because legitimate investment options were providing disappointing returns. Economic conditions that encouraged risk-taking and speculation created environments where criminal organizations could operate with reduced scrutiny. Investors who were desperate for higher returns were often willing to overlook warning signs that they would have recognized during more conservative economic periods. The combination of economic pressure and reduced vigilance created perfect conditions for sophisticated fraud schemes to flourish. But economic downturns also created different opportunities for criminal activity. People who were facing financial hardship were often vulnerable to employment scams, pyramid schemes, and other criminal operations that promised quick solutions to their economic problems. The same desperation that had driven Derek to criminal activity also made potential victims more susceptible to criminal manipulation. My federal work required understanding these economic cycles and their relationship to different types of criminal activity. Financial criminals were opportunistic, adapting their schemes to exploit whatever economic conditions and psychological vulnerabilities were most prevalent during any given period. Effective investigation required anticipating these adaptations and developing countermeasures before criminal organizations could establish sophisticated operations. The Preston case had also demonstrated the importance of community awareness in preventing financial crime. Many of the victims I'd encountered during the investigation had been attracted to criminal investment schemes because they'd trusted people who appeared to be successful members of their social communities. The criminals' ability to maintain facades of legitimate success had been crucial to their ability to attract and retain victims. Education and awareness campaigns that helped potential victims recognize warning signs of financial fraud were often more effective than enforcement actions that occurred after crimes had already been committed. Teaching people to verify investment credentials, research business backgrounds, and maintain healthy skepticism about opportunities that seemed too good to be true could prevent criminal schemes from gaining the traction necessary for large-scale operations. My speaking engagements at community organizations and professional conferences focused on these prevention strategies, emphasizing that sophisticated criminals often appeared completely legitimate until their schemes collapsed. The same attention to detail that had helped me identify Derek's criminal activities could help other people protect themselves from similar schemes. But I also emphasized that individual vigilance was only part of the solution. Financial crime prevention required coordinated efforts by regulatory agencies, law enforcement organizations, and professional associations that could share information and identify patterns that might not be visible to individual observers. The Preston investigation had succeeded because multiple organizations had been willing to share resources and expertise toward a common goal. The networking relationships I developed during the federal investigation continued to provide valuable resources for my ongoing work. Former colleagues from the insurance industry, federal agents from multiple agencies, and academic researchers studying financial crime had formed an informal community of professionals who regularly shared information about emerging threats and investigative techniques. This collaborative approach had proven more effective than traditional law enforcement methods that relied primarily on reactive investigations of reported crimes. Proactive identification of criminal operations required expertise from multiple disciplines and organizations that could provide different perspectives on complex criminal schemes. My experience with the Preston case had also taught me about the personal costs of becoming involved in major criminal investigations. The stress and uncertainty of dealing with dangerous criminals, the time commitments required for thorough investigations, and the emotional impact of learning about the harm caused to crime victims had all taken tolls that I hadn't anticipated when I'd first begun documenting Derek's suspicious behavior. But the satisfaction of helping to bring justice to crime victims and preventing additional criminal activity had made these costs worthwhile. The knowledge that my observations and analysis had contributed to recovering millions of dollars for defrauded investors and preventing additional crimes provided meaning and purpose that had been missing from my previous work in insurance fraud investigation. The transition from private sector insurance work to federal law enforcement had required adjustments to different organizational cultures, legal procedures, and investigative standards. But the core skills of financial analysis, behavioral observation, and methodical documentation had proven transferable across these different professional environments. My colleagues at the SEC often expressed amazement at the chain of events that had led from simple traffic disputes to major federal criminal prosecutions. The story had become something of a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining professional ethics and personal integrity, regardless of financial pressures or competitive disadvantages. But I always emphasized that the success of the Preston investigation had been based on teamwork and institutional support rather than individual heroics. My observations had provided an entry point for the investigation, but the actual work of building criminal cases and securing convictions required expertise and resources that only federal agencies could provide. The experience had reinforced my belief in the importance of supporting law enforcement and regulatory agencies that protected citizens from sophisticated criminal operations. Individual vigilance and community awareness were important, but they were no substitute for professional investigators who could dedicate full-time attention to complex criminal schemes. My current work continued to provide opportunities to apply the lessons learned from the Preston case to new investigations and prevention efforts. Each case was different, but the fundamental principles of careful observation, methodical analysis, and patient investigation remained constant across different types of financial crime. The turtle's approach to life had proven more powerful than I'd ever imagined, not just in protecting me from criminal manipulation, but in providing the foundation for a career dedicated to protecting others from similar threats. The same qualities that had made me a careful driver had made me an effective criminal investigator, capable of recognizing patterns and inconsistencies that others missed. Looking back on the entire experience, I was struck by how random events and personal choices had combined to create opportunities for meaningful contribution to public safety and justice. My decision to maintain careful driving habits, despite harassment and intimidation, had been based on professional training and personal principles, not any anticipation of the consequences that would follow. But the experience had also demonstrated that individual integrity and professional competence could have impacts far beyond their immediate contexts. My commitment to safety and lawful behavior had ultimately contributed to dismantling a criminal network that had been harming hundreds of families across multiple states. The lesson was clear. Maintaining your principles under pressure, even when facing criticism or harassment, could create opportunities to make meaningful differences in the lives of people you might never meet. The turtle's victory had been complete, achieved through persistence and integrity rather than speed or aggression. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.